FIA, Foundation for Indigenous Americans of Anasazi Heritage, represents Negro Americans in our original ethnic identity of Anasazi. That was the name of our race before we were changed to American Indians. And in 1705, American Indian women and the descendants of American Indian women were changed to Negro and were used in the captivity of the slave trade that we have known so and have been so eloquently educated and miseducated about, which has become a very, very deep thorn. You know, it's like a constant wound bleeding since this horrible education to dehumanize us has been a part of our experience. No one is born a slave. Slave is an experience that is put on a captured or a oppressed people. And set the record straight on the ethnic identity of all Black American people who are descendants from Negro women and men. Period. In I Have a Dream speech, you know, many people say, well, we came from boats on Africa, from Africa. And this is not true. So I wanted to give some documentation to clarify this issue, because we're not Africans. We're not African Americans. We are the Americans. Okay, so on that note, I am not the only one. I felt that the best documentation to give, to put out there for everybody so that everyone knows who they are, is documentation directly from Martin Luther King. And in Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, third paragraph, and as you see I marked it here for you, third paragraph, it makes it very clear on who we are.
But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free.
But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination.
100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination.
100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity.
100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity.
100 years later, the Negro is still languished in the corners of American society and finds himself an exile in his own land.
100 years later, the Negro is still languished in the corners of American society, finds himself in exile in his own land.
Now, of course, if it's his land, it's also who? Her land. Women are the ones who create the races. All nations are created from the wombs of the women of their species. So, Martin Luther King didn't say exile in Africa or as a captive in a foreign land. He didn't say as an African living in a land. He said exile. And as people, we are still living and being considered a nation in exile within a nation. And I'm saying this because there's too many people who are being robbed of their human dignity and just being totally exploited over this question of Black Indians. There is no such thing as a Black Indian. There is no such thing as half Indian. All descendants from American Indian women are Negroes or Negroes. And I don't want to use the derogatories of colored and Negroes and all these other things to denote, But that means, what does that mean? What was Martin Luther King saying? He was saying that he was indigenous and that we were being excluded from the artificial society. And one thing he constantly called the United States was our nation, because they had been told that they were to be included